No, good night.
Wait a minute. There's more time.
Good night, sir.
It took 50 years for Dick Cavett to name the 7 famous guests who were actually evil. Producers from ABC begged him to stay quiet, but he said, "People deserve to know what really happened on my stage. Who were the legends behind the smiles? And what secret made even Cavett lose his calm?" Let's find out. Number 7, Norman Mailer. He walked onto that stage in December 1971 like a man entering a trial, not an interview. Norman Mailer had just released The Prisoner of Sex, a book that tore into feminism and drew fire from nearly every serious critic in New York. Therefore, ABC brought him onto the Dick Cavett Show and sat him across from Gore Vidal, a rival who knew exactly where to hit him.
Hi, I'm Dick Cavett. My guests tonight are Janet Flanner, Norman Mailer, and Gore Vidal, the latter two in a show for the whole family.
The crowd expected tension. They got live combat. Mailer and Vidal had history. In print, Vidal had called Mailer's view of women the macho tantrum of a trapped man, and Mailer answered by literally headbutting Vidal at a party days before the taping. That was the energy in the room even before the first question. Cavett's team packed the studio. Every seat taken, people standing in the aisles, extra chairs brought in from the hallway. It felt like a boxing venue, not late-night TV. Once the cameras rolled, Mailer stopped pretending. He turned away from Cavett, leaned his whole body toward Vidal, and began swinging with words. He accused Vidal of lying, of twisting his work, of smearing the great American novel with cheap insults. The studio laughed at first. Then the tone shifted. The laughter grew nervous. You could hear single coughs between lines. Mailer started talking over everyone. He cut Cavett off. He called the questions stupid. He spoke like he owned the air. Cavett, who usually let guests run, made a decision in that moment. He pushed back. At one point, Mailer tried to dominate the table with a sneer. "Why don't you stop talking and let the grown-ups speak?" Cavett answered fast, almost gently, "I will, as soon as they arrive." The room exploded. Even Vidal cracked a smile. Mailer did not. The power flipped for a second. You can feel it on the tape. Cavett stops being the polite moderator and becomes something closer to a handler. He reins the energy in with humor. He refuses to give Mailer full control of the room. However, this choice has a cost. From that point forward, Mailer's face hardens. The charm drains out. The anger stops being performative and turns personal. After the taping, Cavett later said he felt a genuine darkness behind Mailer's eyes, and that it was the first time he wondered if a guest might actually hit him on air. ABC's switchboard went wild that week. Thousands of calls. Ratings jumped more than 20% over the previous Thursday slot. Newspapers called it televised literary violence. That night mattered for another reason, too. Television in the early 70s sold itself as polite, controlled, well-behaved. Cavett's Mailer episode tore that illusion apart. Therefore, from that moment on, Cavett understood something about fame that most viewers never saw. Intelligence can soothe a room, but ego can set it on fire. Number 6, Lester Maddox. The studio felt tense before he even arrived. Lester Maddox, Georgia's governor in 1970, had built a career on defiance. He was famous for standing in the doorway of his Atlanta restaurant in 1964, refusing to serve black customers after the Civil Rights Act. Therefore, when the Dick Cavett Show invited him, many expected fireworks. They got something stronger: humiliation, anger, and one of the strangest walk-offs in live television. Maddox entered in a gray suit and a stubborn smile. Cavett greeted him politely, but the tone cracked fast. Within minutes, they were arguing about segregation, pride, and truth. Cavett said, "Governor, do you feel America has changed since your days with the pick handles?" referring to the wooden sticks Maddox once handed out to drive away protesters. Maddox's eyes hardened. He leaned forward and shot back, "You're twisting history, young man." That single moment shifted everything. The crowd, mostly Northern liberals, laughed nervously. Maddox misread the laughter as mockery. His voice rose. "You call me a liar?" he barked. Cavett, calm but firm, said, "If the shoe fits, wear it." The air thinned. You can hear the silence in the tape before Maddox finally stood, removed his mic, and stormed off stage. Cavett didn't chase him. He stayed seated, watching as producers scrambled. Then, in a move that shocked ABC executives, he kept the cameras rolling. "Let the audience see what happened," he told them later.
No, good night.
Wait a minute, there's more time.
Good night, sir.
The network re-aired the episode uncut, an act of rebellion for 1970 television. Ratings jumped nearly 30% overnight. Newspapers across the country debated whether Cavett had gone too far or simply told the truth. Years later, Cavett said Maddox's anger felt poisonous and performative at once. Maddox even mailed a signed photograph later, scribbled with, "To Dick Cavett, the Yankee who talks too much." Cavett framed it in his office. That episode became more than a talk show moment. It captured the fracture of America on live TV, two worlds colliding under bright studio lights. The country was changing faster than men like Maddox could handle, and that tension spilled through every camera lens that night. Therefore, Cavett learned a deeper truth, that politics could turn a studio into a battlefield faster than any novelist or rock star could. But what happens when the guest across from you doesn't shout? He takes control instead, refusing to let the host speak, snapping his fingers to command the band and making the show his own kingdom. Number 5. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra never stepped onto Dick Cavett's stage, yet his shadow hung over it like a ghost with a grudge. The story began in 1970 when Cavett's producers reached out to book Sinatra during his Vegas comeback. Sinatra was touring again, filling hotels, pulling six-figure nights, and rebuilding his reputation after years of rough headlines. Therefore, the idea of him on Cavett's smart, unpredictable show sounded perfect. But then the phone call started. Before Cavett could even shake Sinatra's hand, his people called with a list. No jokes about his marriages, no questions about the mafia rumors, and no audience surprises. They even demanded that Cavett send his questions ahead of time, word for word. Cavett refused. He later said, "They wanted to control the air I breathed." The interview collapsed before it began. However, the tension didn't stop there. Months later, Cavett mentioned Sinatra during a monologue. It was a simple joke, something about the chairman of the board being more bored than chairman that night. Sinatra's camp exploded. A week later, one of Sinatra's close friends, a studio fixer named Hank Sanicola, called ABC threatening to pull sponsorships from Cavett's show. The network stood by Cavett. Sinatra never forgave him. Behind the curtain, Cavett heard stories from crew members who worked with Sinatra's team. They said he'd berate sound operators, call female assistants cupcake, and mock the writers during rehearsal. One cameraman claimed Sinatra once refused to sing until a lighting tech was replaced. The man had adjusted a spotlight without asking him. That was the level of control he demanded. Absolute and immediate. Cavett later joked that Sinatra was the guest who never sat on my couch but haunted the show. Even without appearing, he caused more trouble than most guests who did. In 1971, a rumor spread that Sinatra had offered to do a show with Cavett if the network fired his head writer. Cavett laughed it off, saying, if true, it was the most expensive interview never filmed. Still, the story lingered. Sinatra's absence said more than his presence ever could. His need for command, his power over rooms, even when he wasn't there, that's what made him dangerous on live TV. Therefore, Cavett learned that silence could be louder than any outburst. But what happens when the next guest doesn't walk away or hide? He takes the microphone, commands the band, and talks until everyone else disappears. James Brown, When James Brown walked onto the Dick Cavett show in 1974, the crowd stood up before the band even played a note. He didn't wait for Cavett to welcome him. He strutted straight to the chair, smiled wide, and began talking. Fast, sharp, unstoppable. Within seconds, the show turned into something between a sermon and a takeover. Brown had just come off a grueling tour, 50 cities in less than 3 months. His single, The Payback, was climbing the charts, and he felt untouchable. Therefore, when Cavett asked, "How do you balance music and money?" Brown leaned forward and said, "I am money." Then he snapped his fingers at the band. The drummer hit a groove. The audience cheered. Cavett tried to speak again, but Brown raised his hand. "Hold up, brother. We're in the spirit." The producers froze in the control room. It was live television. Brown was hijacking their runtime minute by minute. Cavett glanced toward the stage manager, but Brown kept going. Stories about business, respect, taxes, even God. At one point he said, "They say I got 15 cars. That's wrong. I got 16. The audience roared again. However, beneath the laughter, there was tension. Cavett later said Brown had an energy that made the air shake. No cue cards, no rehearsal, just pure force. When Cavett tried steering the talk toward politics, Brown snapped again. "Politics? I own my politics." Then he called for his sax player, who walked right onto the set and started playing live. For 10 straight minutes, the show turned into a James Brown concert. A BC executives panicked backstage. One yelled, "Cut to commercial." Cavett refused. He sat back, smiling. "I wanted to see how far he'd go," he said years later. When the song ended, Brown wiped his face with a silk handkerchief and finally leaned back. "You all feel good now?" he asked the crowd. They screamed. Then he looked at Cavett and said softly, "You got to let a man be free." The segment became one of Cavett's most replayed interviews of the decade. Ratings spiked. So did the arguments behind the scenes. Some called it chaos, others called it genius. Therefore, Cavett realized that charisma could swallow a camera whole. But what happens when that charisma turns surreal? When a guest walks in with an animal, speaks in riddles, and makes the studio feel like another planet? Number 3. Salvador Dali. The studio lights hit bright that night in 1970, but Salvador Dali didn't walk in. He arrived. He carried a cane tipped with silver, wore a cape lined with red silk, and had a look that said reality was optional. Cavett leaned back, smiling carefully. He knew this wouldn't be an ordinary interview. Therefore, when Dali waved to the crowd and announced, "I am surrealism," the audience didn't laugh. They believed him. Moments later, he reached into a small box beside his chair. Out came a live anteater, a real one, squirming and clawing. The room gasped. The animal crawled across the stage, right into the lap of silent film legend Lillian Gish, who happened to be seated nearby. She froze. Dali simply nodded, as if it proved a point no one understood. Cavett tried steering the conversation. "So, Mr. Dali, what does the anteater represent?" Dali blinked slowly and replied, "The future of reason." The crowd half laughed, half stared. Cavett once said it was the only time he couldn't tell if his guest was joking or preaching. However, behind the spectacle, there was a sharper story. Dali was 66 that year, at the height of his fame, but desperate to stay relevant in a decade ruled by rock stars and radicals. He had painted hundreds of works, signed deals with perfume brands, and charged galleries in gold coins instead of checks. Some critics called him a sellout. He called himself immortal. At one point, Cavett asked him about Picasso. Dali grinned and said, "Picasso is Spanish. I am genius." The audience erupted. Cavett didn't know whether to laugh or call security. Then Dali pulled a sketch pad from his bag. Right there during the show, he drew a portrait of Cavett in less than 2 minutes. Bold strokes, wild lines, no hesitation. When he handed it over, Cavett later said, It looked more like fear than me. That interview became television legend. The anteater, the riddles, the chaos, all captured live. Newspapers the next morning called it art on the edge of insanity. Cavett called it a glimpse into the mind of a man who made logic feel small. Therefore, he learned that madness could be entertaining if it wore a crown. But what happens when that crown belongs to two people at once? A couple so famous, so drunk on love and jealousy, they turned his stage into a battlefield? Number 2. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. They entered the studio together in 1970, hand in hand. Already famous for loving each other too loudly. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. Two names that filled every gossip page and broke every box office record. The moment they sat down beside Dick Cavett, the air changed. You could feel it. Therefore, when Burton lit his cigarette on air, the audience leaned forward. Everyone knew something unpredictable might happen. Taylor looked dazzling that night. Violet eyes, white dress, a diamond necklace that nearly blinded the lights. Cavett opened with a simple question about their latest film. Boom! Before he could finish, Burton laughed under his breath and said, "Ah, the disaster." The crowd chuckled. Taylor frowned. Then she corrected him on camera. It was ahead of its time. He smirked and replied, "Then time has a lot to answer for." The laughter stopped there. For a few seconds, it was silent. Cavett later said he felt like a third wheel in a very public argument. But then Taylor turned charming again, laughing softly, brushing off the tension. That's what made them so magnetic. 1 minute rage, the next minute tenderness. However, that balance could snap at any second. Halfway through the show, Burton began teasing her about her perfume line, saying she made more money smelling good than acting good. Taylor shot back, "At least I sell out perfume, Richard." The studio audience gasped. Cavett tried to calm it with humor. "I feel like I'm at a dinner table without the wine," he joked. Taylor quickly raised her glass and said, "You can borrow mine." They both laughed, but Cavett later said their eyes never softened. It was like watching fire disguised as glamour. He described the couple as Shakespeare in sequins, loud, beautiful, dangerous. After the taping, Taylor stormed off first. Burton followed 5 minutes later. Crew members said you could still smell her perfume long after they were gone. That episode became one of Cavett's highest-rated shows. Millions tuned in, hoping to catch a real moment between Hollywood's most volatile lovers. Therefore, Cavett learned that passion could entertain and destroy at the same time. But what happens when the next guest isn't fueled by passion or fame, but by secrets buried in tape recorders and power locked behind the Oval Office door? Number 1. Richard Nixon. When Richard Nixon smiled on television, people either trusted him or flinched. Dick Cavett saw both reactions in the same night. It was 1971, and the tension between the White House and the Dick Cavett show had already started to boil. Nixon avoided a full sit-down interview, but his people were everywhere. Advisors, speechwriters, even spies sitting quietly in Cavett's audience. Therefore, when Cavett made a passing joke about Watergate, phones rang in Washington the next morning. The Nixon team called ABC executives, furious. They warned Cavett to stay in his lane. He didn't. Instead, he invited guests like Daniel Ellsberg, the man behind the Pentagon Papers. The episode drew over 12 million viewers. Cavett said later, "You could feel the air stiffen when Ellsberg walked in." The studio filled with whispers. Then Ellsberg started speaking about secrets, lies, and a president who feared comedians more than congressmen. However, the real fire started after that show aired. Cavett's mail doubled overnight. Some letters praised him for standing up to power, while others called him un-American. One arrived stamped with no return address and 2 words written in red ink: "You're finished." Cavett laughed about it years later, but in 1972 it didn't feel funny. During that same year, Nixon's team began cataloging journalists they considered enemies. Cavett's name appeared on that list. He said he found out through a Senate aide who whispered, "You made it into the big leagues. Nixon hates you." It wasn't an exaggeration. White House recordings later revealed that Nixon ordered dirty tricks against Cavett's show. One memo suggested pressuring ABC to move his airtime to midnight. Therefore, Cavett fought back the only way he knew, on camera. He invited guests who questioned authority, from senators to Vietnam veterans. His calm voice became a quiet weapon. Ratings soared. Viewers tuned in because they felt something real was happening on that stage. Years later, when the Watergate tapes came out, Cavett listened to the moment Nixon mentioned him by name. "That Cavett fellow," Nixon said, "thinks he's clever." Cavett smiled when he heard it. "If a president fears your jokes," he said, "you're probably doing something right." That night changed how late-night television handled truth. But what happens when a different kind of darkness enters a studio? Not political, but personal. When the guest walks in ready to argue, insult, and challenge the host to an actual fight, click the next video on your screen right now before it disappears. It continues this story and reveals what really happened next.